Laura decided it was time to seize the day and truly live. "Enough is enough. I'm 35, and I deserve happiness," she declared as she clicked on a travel agency's website. Instead of Turkey or Egypt, Laura chose Cyprus, a place she had visited many times during her university days with friends and later with her family, her son Daniel and her husband Basil. Laura met Basil when she was 25. He was everything she dreamed of: tall, wealthy, handsome, with a distinctive mole on his chin. She fell head over heels and swiftly decided to tie her life to his. At first, their life was straight out of a romance novel, but a year after Daniel was born, things began to shift. Basil started coming home late, staying at work until midnight, and his business trips became prolonged monthly stays, often to sunny destinations. Laura couldn't bear to think he had a lover, but Basil's constant new excuses wore her down. Despite everything, Laura's love for Basil endured. She pleaded with him to spend more time with their son, but his interest in the child was minimal. He would only give Laura money and then disappear again. One night, Basil left and never returned. Laura replayed that terrible day in her mind almost every day, shedding tears until she was too exhausted to cry. She hid her despair from Daniel, who still believed his daddy was on a business trip. But yesterday, Laura decided enough was enough. She had to stop living in the past. On that February night, Laura paced her apartment with her phone in hand, anxious for the third day in a row. Basil was supposed to return from a business trip 3 days ago, but his phone was off, and he hadn't responded to any messages. "Mum, why are you sad?" Daniel, her 5-year-old son, asked. "I'm not sad." "Why are you still awake?" she replied. Daniel sighed and went back to bed, unaware of the gravity of the situation. Basil had become a distant figure, barely speaking to his son and not visiting his room for months. "Hello, Robert," Laura said with a nervous excitement. She had met the company's director at several corporate events. "I need to know about my husband's trip. Do you have any updates? I haven't been able to reach Basil, and he was supposed to come home 3 days ago." "What trip?" the director asked, puzzled. "Martha, what are you talking about?" "The new factory opening," she stammered, nearly dropping the phone. "Wasn't Basil there for that?" "We don't have any new factory and we don't plan to have one. Basil informed me that he would take 2 weeks of vacation at his own expense." "Martha, I really don't understand what you're talking about." "Vacation," Laura whispered and hung up the phone. She sat slowly on the couch and covered her face with her hands. Basil's lies had crossed all reasonable limits this time. If before he had tried to cover up with excuses, now he had decided simply not to come back home, turning off the phone. She couldn't stand this any longer. Of course, she should have left earlier at the first signs of his affair, but Laura stayed with Basil for Daniel. Her husband could provide a comfortable life, education and trips for the child, and if she left Basil, Laura would have to raise the child and work at the same time. She didn't know how long she could keep up that pace and how it would affect Daniel. Although, of course, that wasn't the only reason Laura refused to leave her husband. Despite Basil's repugnant behavior, she still loved him. But now she had to overcome herself. Enough humiliation already. Many women leave and manage to raise several children without problems. And Laura definitely could do it with Daniel. These thoughts were interrupted by a phone call from Robert. "Laura, it's me again. Anyway, someone called me. Yes, Basil is really on a business trip, but not at the factory," the director said, quickly and unsure. "I think it's better not to talk about this over the phone. Can I come to see you now?" Laura agreed. She cleaned the apartment as best as she could and waited for Robert. The office of Basil's company was 10 minutes away by car from her house, so soon the doorbell rang. After greeting each other, the director entered the apartment. They sat on the couch and remained silent for 15 seconds. The director seemed unable to find the words. He didn't know where to start. "Laura," he began, sighing heavily. In short, Basil went to Norway to ride snowmobiles on the ice. Basil and his friends often go there. Often. Laura was still surprised by the new discoveries of her husband's life. "Yes, but now it's not about that. Right after your call, a colleague entered my office and gave me some information from Norway. There was a slight increase in temperature there. Of course, the use of snowmobiles is prohibited under such conditions, but what? Speak up." Laura couldn't stand it anymore. "But Basil decided to go down to the ice anyway, and he fell. How is it possible?" The woman turned pale. "Do you need an ambulance?" Robert asked, frightened. "No, it's not necessary. Did he die?" "The thing is, it didn't happen on the lake itself, but on the river near it. There was a strong underground current there, so they still haven't found Basil's body alive." Laura felt as if she had been hit on the head. 15 minutes ago, she was cursing Basil and had decided to leave him, and now she finds out that he is dead. Laura stared into the void. Before her, like in an old silent film, scenes of her life passed. Robert went to the kitchen, brought a glass of water for the woman. "But I promise the company will help you with the inheritance and any legal questions." "But how is it possible? If they haven't found Basil yet, what if he's still alive?" "Sometimes they can declare someone dead without finding the body. I understand you don't want to accept this loss, but they assured me there was no chance Basil could be saved. I'm sorry." Laura no longer listened to what Robert was saying. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. She didn't understand how to continue living now. She pulled herself together a bit, dismissed the director, and sat in the kitchen. "I'm not crying, it's just my eyes are watery. Why aren't you sleeping again?" "I heard you talking with some guy. Is he the guy from Dad's office?" "And where's Dad?" "Dad—" Laura fell silent. What to say next? She didn't know. She didn't want to inform her 5-year-old son about his father's death, or tell him that he had gone to heaven. So Laura decided to postpone it until Daniel asked about his dad again. Dad is on a trip again as always, only this time he'll stay a bit longer. And what is he doing there? Daniel was at that age when kids ask endless questions, and now it was especially difficult for Laura to answer these questions. He is discovering new worlds, exploring mountains, lakes, seas, generally working and traveling. I also want to discover new worlds. When you grow up, you can discover anything you want, but now it's time to sleep. You know people grow more while they sleep, so the sooner you go to bed, the faster you'll grow. Come on, go to bed. The child approached the door but suddenly stopped, turned around, and asked a question he'd never asked during all of Basil's trips. "When is Dad coming back?" "I don't know." Laura barely managed to hold back tears in front of her son. "Not soon. He has a difficult and long trip solving complicated problems. You can't discover a new world in a week, right?" Daniel nodded and went to his room. For the first time in several years, Laura was even glad that her husband paid almost no attention to his son. She couldn't imagine how she would explain the situation to Daniel if Basil were an attentive and caring father. And now there was a possibility that the boy would completely forget his dad and not ask anything. Of course, in a few years, when Daniel becomes a teenager, she will have to tell him the whole truth. But that will be later. Now, for Laura, the most important thing was to preserve the child's psyche as much as possible and not burden him with alarming news. But what about herself? Basil's infidelities, his second life, and other tricks did not ease the anguish of his death. Laura already knew she loved her husband, but now she felt it especially acutely. She was in a psychological trap. If at the moment she decided to leave her husband, Laura could drown her feelings and attachment to him with anger and resentment. Now she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't be angry, and you can't be angry at someone who died. His infidelities seemed to have been erased from her memory. She remembered only the happy moments of their relationship. Most of the happy moments were at the beginning of their journey together, and now the memories of those times were hitting Laura. She went into the room and took the family photo album from the shelf. After flipping through a few pages, Laura saw a photo where she and Basil were sitting together on a snowmobile. In those days, her husband took her with him on all his trips and expeditions, including snowmobile rides. He was a professional, could handle a snowmobile with his eyes closed. Laura remembered, drying her tears. How did this horrible situation happen? It's not like him. I can't believe it. The woman closed the album, managed to pull herself together for a few minutes, calmed down a bit, but then felt an incredible bitterness again. She could only contain her hysteria by thinking about her son's peace of mind. She wanted to run somewhere, call, scream, raise the alarm, demand that they continue searching for her husband. She thought about redialing Robert's number, but stopped herself in time. What would be the point now? Laura couldn't influence the search. It was foolish to try to convince someone that her husband couldn't die in such an absurd way because he was skilled at handling a snowmobile. She calmed down again and sat on the couch. Laura couldn't think of anything. She wanted to fall asleep as soon as possible and wake up as always, watching her husband rush to work and say goodbye silently before disappearing again for several days. She took some valerian and went to bed, unable to sleep. Laura repeated mentally, "Wait and hope, wait and hope." She didn't want to let go of her husband, or rather, she was willing to let him go from the family. But she couldn't let Basil disappear from her life completely. The valerian began to take effect, and Laura finally managed to sleep. The next morning, Laura woke up feeling a bit more composed. She prepared breakfast for Daniel and herself, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. "Mom, can we go to the park today?" Daniel asked, his eyes full of innocent hope. "Of course, sweetheart. We'll go right after breakfast," Laura replied with a forced smile, hiding her inner turmoil. As they strolled through the park, Laura's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She watched Daniel play on the swings, his laughter filling the air, and felt a pang of sorrow. How could she protect his innocence in the midst of such a tragedy? In the days that followed, Laura focused on creating a stable routine for Daniel. She enrolled him in activities to keep him engaged and distracted. She also sought the support of close friends and family who rallied around her during this difficult time. One evening, Laura received a call from Robert. "Laura, I have some news. They found Basil's body," he said gently. Laura felt her knees weaken and she sank into a chair. "Thank you for letting me know, Robert. I appreciate your support," she replied, her voice trembling. The funeral was a somber affair. Friends, family, and colleagues gathered to pay their respects. Laura stood by Daniel, holding his small hand tightly. As they lowered Basil's casket into the ground, Laura whispered a silent goodbye, hoping to find some semblance of closure. In the months that followed, Laura focused on rebuilding her life. She sought therapy to help process her grief and find ways to move forward. She also dedicated herself to being the best mother she could be for Daniel, ensuring he felt loved and secure. As time passed, Laura began to see glimpses of hope. She found solace in her work, engaged in hobbies she had long neglected, and slowly started to envision a future where she could find happiness again. Through it all, she held on to the belief that, despite the pain, she had the strength to build a new life for herself and her son. The story of Laura and Basil is a poignant reminder of the complexities of love, loss, and resilience. It illustrates the power of hope and the human capacity to endure even the most challenging circumstances. Laura's journey is one of transformation, as she learns to navigate the storms of life and emerge stronger on the other side. With each passing day, waiting and hoping became less frequent in her mind. Frank was officially declared dead, even though his body was never found. Robert kept his promise, helping to organize the inheritance, providing financial support, and securing a remote job for Laura. Laura managed to balance raising her son with earning a living, but she could never let go of her husband. 3 years of mourning. Laura refused to take vacations or have fun. She only smiled when talking to her son. He remained the only meaning in her life. Then 3 years passed. On a website page, a friendly girl smiled, holding tickets in one hand and a sign saying, "Happy holidays for the whole family," in the other. Laura sighed deeply and pressed the buy button. "Daniel," Laura said aloud, "next week we're going on vacation." For 7 days she prepared for the trip with her son, focusing not so much on packing, but on psychologically accepting her new life, her new image, not as a grieving widow whose husband deceived her for years before dying in an accident, but as a woman living a full life. The week passed quickly, and Laura hardly noticed how time flew by. It was time to head to the airport. Once there, Laura and Daniel sat in the waiting area. The last time she was at an airport was 5 years ago with Frank, when they sent their son to his grandmother's house and took a week off in Turkey. The memories returned to Laura, but she managed to push them aside. Laura took Daniel's hand and headed to the boarding area amidst a never-ending stream of people. Near the boarding gate, there were fewer people waiting for their flight, and she and her son sat down by the gate. Laura looked at their fellow travelers, also waiting for their flight. Most people seemed to be in good spirits, probably heading off on vacation. A group of young people laughed at some video on the internet. 2 older women browsed through newspapers, usually found in airport kiosks. A few rows away, there was a couple, a young woman around 25, with dyed blonde hair, and a man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses. It was hard to determine the man's age because he was sitting with his head slightly inclined towards his companion, so his hat completely covered his face. The man was passionately telling something to the young woman, but her facial expression showed she was not interested. She was engrossed in her phone and not responding to his stories. Laura decided not to continue observing the fascinating dynamics between the man in the hat and his companion, and shifted her attention to her phone. 15 minutes later, the announcer called for boarding. Laura and Daniel found their seats. Daniel sat by the window, and his mother sat next to him. "Daniel, this is your first conscious flight," said Laura excitedly. The last time they flew together, he wasn't even 2 years old. "This is so cool, Mum. I'm glad we're flying together." "You probably don't remember anything from the last time you flew, do you?" Laura asked, realizing with horror that she shouldn't have asked that question. "Well," the boy looked thoughtfully out the window. "No, I don't really remember anything." Laura sighed in relief. She had been worried that Daniel might have memories associated with his father. Over the past 3 years, Daniel barely remembered his dad, asking only about his travels to explore new worlds. Laura made up stories about how his father's group got stuck due to bad weather, met strange people, and other fairy tales. Daniel was growing up and asked fewer questions about his father. In the last year and a half, he hadn't even asked about him, but Laura still constantly worried that Daniel's classmates might say something about their parents, which could spark new questions about his dad. Fortunately, this never happened. Perhaps because she knew the mothers of Daniel's friends, and these mothers, knowing Laura's situation, asked their children not to mention parents around Daniel. Or maybe she was just lucky. But she understood that in the coming years, she would have to have a serious conversation with her son. Laura even sought advice from a psychologist on how to do it best. They recommended various psychological techniques, but she didn't find any that seemed suitable. "Mom, look, we're above the clouds," exclaimed the boy, admiring the flight. Laura looked at her son and remembered the flight they had taken with Frank and Daniel. The boy was sitting quietly on Frank's lap, looking out the window. Other children were screaming all over the cabin, but Daniel was quietly sitting on his father's lap. Laura looked at her family and couldn't be happier with this idyllic scene. She never thought that flight would be their last family flight. A year and a half later, Laura and Frank also flew for a vacation, but without Daniel. By then, the first misunderstandings and suspicions between Laura and Frank had already begun, and the purpose of the trip was to get closer. But it didn't work. Even after the vacation, their relationship worsened. Laura called the flight attendant and asked for water. She didn't want to remember her husband, but her memory played a cruel trick on her. Laura began to worry again. She even felt offended at herself for breaking her own decision to start a new life. But nothing. She had to try again. Laura drank some water, closed her eyes, and tried to sleep. "Mom, I need to go to the bathroom." Daniel woke Laura. "Let me accompany you." "Mom, I'm old enough to find the bathroom on the plane. I'm 8 years old. Besides, the lady showed us before the flight. If we need help, we can ask her." "You are very smart, my love," said Laura, letting her son into the aisle. She watched Daniel walk confidently to the front of the plane, where the flight attendant welcomed him and showed him the bathroom. Laura, making sure her son got where he needed to go, turned to look out the window. The plane had already reached the appropriate altitude and was flying smoothly, but after a minute, a voice was heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are approaching a turbulence zone, and there may be a slight shake in the plane. We ask you to remain calm, the situation is normal, and everything will end in a minute." The pilot didn't have time to finish those words when the plane began to shake. "Daniel, my boy." Laura thought about her son. He'll be scared there. Laura got up from her seat, wanting to go to the bathroom, but a female voice was heard from somewhere behind her. "Mom, please sit down. We are in a turbulence zone, and the safety rules require it." The flight attendant tried to get Laura to sit down, but she interrupted her. "I have my son there. I need to pass." "Don't worry. He will be fine." At that moment, Daniel came out of the bathroom, walked calmly to his seat, but suddenly stopped abruptly. After a few moments, he continued walking, but much faster. When Daniel got closer, Laura saw his pale and scared face. "Mom," he said in a trembling voice. Daniel, what's wrong? Were you scared? This is called turbulence. There's nothing to worry about." Laura decided that the sudden turbulence had scared her son. "Mom," Daniel repeated, almost whispering. "My dad is sitting there with a lady." Laura quickly let her son sit down. "Son, what are you saying? Maybe it was just your imagination." "No, I saw him clearly. He just had a different hairstyle, but it was him. Go and look. Maybe you're very tired from the long flight. Rest. Let's recline the seat and you can sleep." You don't believe me? Why wouldn't I believe you? I think there are many people in the world, and some of them look very similar. So you probably found someone who looks a lot like your dad. I know it was him, said the boy. He crossed his arms and looked out the window. Laura understood that trying to convince her son was useless. Besides, it was hard for her to maintain a calm and casual tone. Pretending that everything was fine for her son's sake, she was more worried than Daniel. She tried to convince herself that there couldn't be any Frank there. Probably the memories of the childhood flight awakened in her son, so he thought his dad was flying somewhere. It seemed like it would be quite easy to check. Just get up, go to the bathroom, and come back. But Laura didn't dare to do it, and if there really was someone very similar to Frank sitting there, it would completely throw her off balance. Laura didn't get up from her seat for the rest of the flight. She even feared to turn her head towards the aisle. An hour and a half later, the plane began to descend and landed 20 minutes later without any problems. The passengers stood up from their seats and began to take their belongings from the overhead compartments. While the plane had not yet reached the gate, Laura was not one of those always in a hurry people, and didn't want to stand with her son in the aisle for 5 more minutes. She decided to wait seated until the door opened and most of the people exited the plane. Laura sat quietly, watching the standing people. At that moment, a man in one of the front rows stood up from his seat and reached for his things. Laura immediately understood that this man was who Daniel had mistaken for his father. The man was incredibly similar to Frank, only his face was a bit wider and his haircut shorter. He reached for his hat, and Laura saw a mole under his chin. It can't be, she thought. No, this is some kind of dream, some crazy coincidence. I don't want to believe this. It's absurd. Laura was trembling. It was very hard for her to hide her emotions, but she did it for her son's sake. Meanwhile, the man put on his wide-brimmed hat, took the hand of a blonde woman, and also stood up to leave. The hat covered his face again and people began to exit. After a few minutes, Laura told Daniel to get ready to leave. Laura waited longer than usual, especially to avoid accidentally encountering that man. Leaving the plane via the ramp, she couldn't help but approach the airline employee at the check-in desk. Laura knew that the girl was responsible for another flight, but she had to release her emotions and deal with this situation. "Excuse me, may I ask if a certain person flew with me? Sorry, but I'm waiting for another flight. But theoretically, can you open the database? Isn't it the same airline? Theoretically, I can. But then I would be violating the personal data protection law. Please try to understand me. Maybe." Laura leaned towards the airline employee's ear and continued in a low voice so only she could hear. "My husband was on that flight. He disappeared without a trace a few years ago." The girl looked at Laura and then at Daniel. Apparently, his innocent look broke her integrity, and she decided to break the rules. The girl typed something on her screen and said, "Tell me his full name." "Frank Alvarez." "That person did not fly on your flight. I am very sorry, but I must ask you to leave and not tell anyone what I did." "Yes, of course," Laura responded, bewildered. "I'm sorry." She took Daniel by the hand and walked slowly to the baggage claim area. Laura watched the black conveyor belt where the luggage moved slowly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the man with the hat again. He had already collected his luggage and was heading for the exit with his companion. Thank goodness it's not him, Laura thought. Otherwise, I don't know what I would do. Sometimes these coincidences happen, but the mole... No. I need to forget all this as soon as possible and focus on enjoying my vacation. After collecting their luggage, Laura and her son left the airport and took a taxi to the hotel. Laura liked her room. From the balcony, there was a wonderful view of the sea. She went out to the balcony, took a deep breath, and mentally let go of today's situation. Life goes on. There are many days of rest, sun, and sea ahead, and no random encounter will disturb me anymore, Laura thought. She went back inside and lay down on the wide bed. The first 3 days of vacation for Laura and her son were wonderful. The weather was nice, and there were always free sunbeds on the beaches. The only annoyance was the neighbors who argued some nights, but it didn't stop Laura and her son from sleeping well. In the afternoons, Laura liked to stand on the balcony and look at the sea. It was a kind of daily meditation for her. She calmed herself by watching the sun set somewhere in the distance over the water. On the afternoon of the 4th day, Laura went out to the balcony as usual. It was cloudy that day, so she couldn't enjoy the sunset. Laura was about to go back inside when she suddenly heard the occupants of the room below come out to their balcony. They were talking loudly, and Laura realized it was the same couple who argued at night. "Is there anything in life that interests you besides money, Sarah?" the man asked loudly. "Of course. You have to provide me with something to be interested in something," the girl shouted in response. Laura decided to stay. It wasn't that she liked listening to other people's conversations. But this time she was interested in how far a young woman's insolence could go. Besides, she thought she recognized the man's voice. "Don't I provide you with anything, Sarah?" the man continued to ask. "Are you kidding me? You brought me to this forgotten hole in Cyprus. I need the Maldives, Bailey, you understand. Well, Sarah, this is not a hole. It's a 4-star hotel. The reason your old sugar daddies took you to the Maldives is that they only wanted your body. And you want something more? Of course. I try to teach you something, explain, make you a little smarter. You're so annoying. You sound like an old grouch despite being young." "An old grouch?" "Well, okay." The man's voice softened a bit. "But I'll tell you a secret. You are not getting any younger either, and with the years, what rich men chase after, you will disappear, and what will be left? You'll be a 40-year-old woman with the mind of a 12-year-old. Laura was paralyzed. When the man spoke more softly, she realized it was her husband, Frank. She couldn't mistake him for anyone else. She just took a moment to recognize him because she almost never saw her husband shouting. All their fights and misunderstandings were quiet or silent. Sometimes silence has more impact on people than shouting, and in Laura and Frank's marriage, both partners understood this. But when the man downstairs said, "And what will be left?" Laura had no doubts. It was Frank's favorite phrase. He used it in any argument or difficult conversation, as if asking his interlocutor, "If you don't agree with me, what will happen? What will be left?" But to today's interlocutor, this had no effect. She laughed out loud. "What? Don't you hear what you're saying? At 40, I'll look better than all the exes and future girls combined," she said through laughter, and left the balcony, slamming the door. The supposed Frank stayed a little longer, opened the door, started to say something, and went back inside. Laura was in shock. She wanted to listen to that voice a bit more, to be sure of her suspicions. "Daniel, I have things to do. I'll be back soon," Laura said to her son as she left the balcony. She went to the main door, ran down the hallway, called the elevator, which took forever to arrive. Then Laura ran down the stairs, went down one floor, and found the same number that was directly below hers and Danielle's. Forgetting all etiquette rules, Laura pressed her ear to the door. To what extent can female curiosity go? The couple was still arguing. "Aren't you afraid that I'll just leave now?" "Where will you go, Sarah?" Anywhere? Are there not enough rich men in Cyprus? I will definitely find one richer than you. Then you will regret your words. Anyway, I don't care anymore. Go wherever you want and with whoever you want. I don't care about you or your men. What a miserable old man you are. You will be the first to crawl back to me to ask for forgiveness. You will be on your knees begging me to return. You can think whatever you want. Nobody is going to chase you. What a princess. Oh, won't they? Then goodbye. The girl responded and walked firmly towards the door. Laura barely had time to press against the wall. The girl left the room and ran to the elevator without noticing Laura. What a horror! What am I doing here? I'm standing by the wall, spying on a couple for several minutes. Shame. Laura scolded herself. But her feelings told her that all this spying was justified. There are no such coincidences. First the plane, then the mole, and now also the voice. Either Laura was going crazy or her supposedly deceased husband was really behind the wall. But if she only saw Frank in this man, it could have been attributed to a clouded mind. Frank also recognized Daniel, and children can't be fooled. Of course, some children tend to invent imaginary friends, but Daniel was not one of them. If he said he saw something, it meant he really saw something. Laura decided to move towards the window at the end of the hallway. She needed to breathe after such an experience, but she couldn't rest for long. The door to the room opened and a man came out. Laura barely had time to look away and stare out the window to avoid being discovered prematurely. In the window's reflection, she saw the man lock the room with his card and head for the elevator. When he reached the elevator, Laura decided to follow him. She ran to the stairs and quickly went down, trying to catch the elevator. She made it. They reached the first floor almost simultaneously. Laura watched him walk away. If he lost a couple of pounds and some grey hair, he would be identical to Frank. The man was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, so Laura had no trouble identifying her supposedly deceased husband by his appearance. She followed him to a bar where he ordered a cocktail and settled at the counter. The detective game excited her more and more. Laura raised the collar of her sweater, tousled her hair, and put on her sunglasses hanging from her chest. Laura approached the counter and, in a lower voice than usual, ordered a mojito. She drank it for about 5 minutes, during which time the man, who looked like Frank, drank several shots of tequila, accompanied by a few cocktails. 10 minutes later, the alcohol began to take effect. "Hey girl, tell me." Laura was startled to realize that Frank was addressing her. There was no one else behind the bar. "Why are you all like this?" The man paused, trying to find the right words. "What do you mean?" Laura asked in a low voice. "Complicated." Frank chose the least offensive word. "Maybe it's your perception. Everything is much simpler," she replied. "Ah, there it is, female solidarity. Without knowing anything about my situation, you say it's my perception." "Well, I might have guessed," Laura replied, staring at her empty glass, afraid to face the man. "And what did you guess?" "Obviously, you've argued with your girlfriend. Maybe she's even left, insulted you, and now you're looking for support, for someone to tell you you're right, that she's a fool, that she doesn't understand anything in life." Laura, without hesitation, used the results of her spying. "Yes, you are very clever, you even surprise me. Female intuition really exists. But I'll have to disappoint you." "Why?" "I'm not the person who will tell you how good you are and how bad women are. Maybe in your case, the girl is really a fool, but you're not much smarter. But you're bold. Sorry, I didn't mean to offend you." Laura hadn't realized she had been rude. No, please. Explain what you mean. Laura sighed and realized she would have to say what she really thought about men like Frank. Well, no one forces men to choose young and foolish women. You all run away from intelligent and mature women, cheat on them, and then complain that they only want your money. You read me like an open book, but you know, there are also hormones that make us choose young women. It sounds like an absurd excuse. The ability to fight and control their animal instincts made the monkey become human. And you seem human. Yes, it seems so. Well, then why talk about hormones? Anyway, maybe I'm overstepping. No, I asked. Frank ordered another drink and emptied it in one gulp. Ah, how drunk I am. Sorry, can I ask another question? Sure, go ahead. If you are so smart and know everything about everything, what should I do next? I have no idea. Control your hormones. Anyway, I think your young companion will come back to you tomorrow or the day after. What you do with her then is your choice. I'm not a psychologist. Should I get rid of her? You could, Laura replied, not understanding the true intention of the conversation. Some kind of attraction towards Frank prevented her from just turning around and leaving, urging her to continue talking despite the risk of being discovered. Listen, have we met before? Frank asked, just as Laura was thinking of being discovered. I don't think so. It's my first time here. Your tone of voice sounds very familiar to me. Maybe you're confusing me with someone else, Laura realized, and decided to leave, quickly. Okay. Good luck with your personal life. I have to go. Will we see each other again? Maybe. Laura left the bar and called the elevator. She realized that the only thing that saved her from being discovered was that Frank had had too much to drink. Yes, she no longer considered the possibility that this man wasn't Frank. If, before this conversation, there was a chance that her supposedly deceased husband had, for example, a brother with a similar appearance and mole, now she clearly understood that it was not his brother. The intonation, the look, the voice, the manners. She also remembered how Frank looked when he drank. He never behaved badly, just became a little more talkative. And in the 3 years they were together, his behavior with women didn't change. One here, another there, he would argue with his companion and immediately start chatting amiably with Laura, the same nature of his character. Now, Laura had to decide what to do next. Reveal herself? For what? What was left, as Frank would ask? Just to look him in the eyes? What had she seen in them during their years together? But on the other hand, simply out of curiosity, why had he behaved like that with her? Was it because he wanted to leave for another family in that way? But then he could have simply left her instead of making her suffer, miss him, and cry endlessly for 3 years. How foolish he is, Laura thought as she entered the room. She didn't even realize how her reaction to thoughts about Frank had changed. If before, on the plane, she trembled, barely containing her hysteria, wanting to run somewhere, now she was completely calm and secure. She didn't want to reveal her presence to Frank at any cost and as quickly as possible. The only thing that tormented her was curiosity. Did anyone else in his previous life know that Frank was alive? What was his name now, if the airport employee didn't find him on the passenger list? After these reflections, Laura had 2 options. The first was simply to be glad that the person was alive and not dead, to continue living a peaceful life, enjoy life more, pamper herself. After a couple of years, tell her son that yes, Dad simply left the family and no one knows where he is. What is worse for a child's psyche? The sadness of knowing that Dad died or the disappointment of knowing that he betrayed him. Laura seemed to find the second option more favorable. After all, she would find another man to replace Daniel's father. The second option was to meet with Frank without hiding her identity. This would mean having a difficult conversation, explanations, justifications, and maybe having to face some new passion. But the biggest danger in this option was Laura's feelings, which could play a bad trick on her and make her fall in love with Frank again. But Laura rejected this option. One thing was mourning her tragically deceased husband and remembering the happy moments of their life together, and another very different thing was seeing a liar, a traitor, and a scoundrel in front of her. How could there be love for such a person? Laura still hadn't decided which option to choose. She looked at Daniel sleeping, covered him better, and sighed deeply. The next day, Laura and her son got ready to go to the beach as usual. The weather had improved, and they had to go quickly to secure the lounge chairs. In this part of the beach, there were only hotel guests, so it wasn't too crowded, but on good days the lounge chairs could fill up quickly. Laura stood in front of the mirror, deciding what to wear. She decided to be cautious and took larger sunglasses that covered almost half of her face. Additionally, Laura put on a large hat. She was protecting herself not only from the sun. If Frank was living just below her, the probability of a casual encounter was too high. Laura still hadn't decided whether to approach her ex-husband or not, so for now, she maintained the disguise just in case. When they were ready, Laura took Daniel by the hand and they headed to the elevator. The elevator arrived only a couple of minutes later. Apparently, all the guests had decided to go to the beach that morning. Laura and her son entered the elevator. The elevator stopped on the floor below. The doors opened and the girl with dyed hair, the same companion of Frank, entered. This time, she wasn't using her phone and had a very displeased expression. "I had to wait a long time. They multiply and then occupy the elevators," she said in an unpleasant voice. "How dare you, miss? There's only one elevator for all the floors, and there are many guests." "I waited just like you did," Laura responded calmly. "I don't care how long you waited." The girl looked at Laura with disdain. "You're wearing old clothes and still have something to say." For some reason, insults were met with insults. Laura simply covered Daniel's ears, and they silently arrived at the first floor. In the hotel lobby, there was a wave of excitement. The unpleasant girl immediately got lost in the crowd, which made Laura happy since Frank's companion was probably heading to him. When they got to the beach, Laura realized she was right twice. Last night, she had told Frank the girl would come back to him. It happened even faster than Laura had expected, and indeed the companion was heading towards Frank on the beach, whose responsibility, apparently, was to find free lounge chairs. By chance, there were 2 free lounge chairs very close to the ones Frank found. They were a few rows away, and if she wanted to, she could see and hear their conversations. There was nothing to be done. Laura didn't want to ruin her vacation with her son, so she carefully approached the free lounge chairs and, besides, wasn't afraid of being discovered. She lay down slowly, applied sunscreen to Daniel, and reclined on the lounge chair. She didn't have to wait long for something interesting. The girl started scolding Frank almost immediately. "Couldn't you find a spot closer to the sea?" she complained. "These are the closest. To be closer to the sea, you have to get up early instead of sleeping until 11. Oh, who's talking? And who was drinking until 2 in the morning yesterday? Wasn't it you? I couldn't sleep, waiting for you, and couldn't get up early. I'll remind you, my dear, that you left my side yesterday. How was I to know you'd be back in 2 hours? This will be a lesson for you, so you fear losing me." Frank said nothing, but the girl didn't stop. "I'm doing you a favor, forgetting all the offenses, forgetting your lies, your insult." "When did I insult you?" "And this stay isn't an insult, this terrible hotel. Do you know how long I waited for that damn elevator today? I was with some abandoned mother." After these words, Laura decided to stop listening to the couple's argument, took off her hat, and lowered her head. But the voices still reached her lounge chair. "When will you stop being so mean?" Frank replied quietly. "When you stop being like that? Oh, who do you even resemble? Look at yourself." Laura carefully raised her head and looked at Frank. She herself was interested in who he resembled there. Looking at her ex-husband's face, she got a little scared. Frank was pale, his eyes wandered, and his hands seemed to disobey him. Apparently, he had been in the bar for a long time last night. "Sarah, I need to lie down," Frank said and collapsed on the lounge chair. "Frank!" the girl screamed. "What's wrong with you? Someone help him!" Instantly, the girl's irritation turned into fear. From her face, it could be seen that she was genuinely scared for her man. It wasn't clear what the source of that fear was. Was she afraid of losing the man she loved, or of losing her financial provider? But for Frank, her fear was meaningless. Sarah only screamed in fear and took no real action to help. Then Laura got up from the lounge chair and ran to Frank. She checked his breathing and pulse. Frank was breathing, but his pulse was weak. "Bring an umbrella to cover him from the sun," Laura ordered Sarah. "What? What umbrella? Why?" The girl showed her wit in an emergency. "Well, just go to the hotel and get a doctor faster." The girl ran to the hotel, and Laura realized she would have to provide first aid herself. The others on the beach only watched curiously at what was happening. Laura bent Frank's leg at the knee, turned him on his side, and tilted his head back to clear the airways. Then she ran to the lounge chairs by the sea, took an umbrella for the sun, and placed it next to Frank. After about 30 seconds, the man slowly began to regain consciousness, opened his eyes slowly, and saw Laura. She looked at him without sunglasses or a hat. Laura. He realized he had completely forgotten about the disguise. At that moment, Sarah returned from the hotel with the doctor. The doctor approached Frank, and Laura moved back to her lounge chair. She watched as the doctor injected something into her ex-husband, took his pulse, and spoke to Sarah. "Everything is fine. It's just a faint, probably due to the heat. Now he needs to be taken to a cool room and let him rest." "How will I take him?" the girl asked, surprised. "I'll go on my own myself," Frank whispered. He got up from the lounge chair and looked around. He probably wanted to find Laura, but she had put her sun hat back on in time and was out of Frank's line of sight. Then he and his girlfriend returned to the hotel. Laura stayed on the beach. The situation became even more complicated. Frank knew she had seen him, but they couldn't talk. Would he attribute it to a delirium from the fainting or look for her? The desire to see Frank again completely disappeared for Laura. She looked at Daniel on his phone and thought about his reaction to his father. And Frank would almost certainly want to see his son, and maybe even start participating in his upbringing. What happened today showed Frank with whom it was better to be, with experienced and intelligent women, or with silly and greedy girls. Laura didn't want Frank back in her life. Or rather, she was very afraid of it, especially if he started to repent and apologize in front of her. Laura was compassionate enough to forgive many things, but forgiving betrayal was too much even for her. Laura gathered her things and went to lunch with her son in the hotel cafe. She saw Frank in every man sitting there. She couldn't eat well due to the anxiety. She took Daniel by the hand and returned to their room. As soon as she lay down on the bed, the phone rang. The phone was somewhere in her beach bag, and Laura couldn't find it. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. Laura shouted, "Wait a second!" and continued searching for the phone. After a few seconds, the ringing stopped, and someone knocked on the door again. What's going on? I said, wait a bit, Laura said irritably, went to the door and opened it. Frank was standing in the hallway. Laura immediately closed the door. Laura, wait. Frank's voice was heard from the hallway. Laura waited a few seconds, thought, and reopened the door. How did you find me? At the registration desk. I asked which room my wife was in, and they gave me your name. I'm not your wife, Laura responded firmly, aware of her ex-husband's cunning. I understand how you feel now, but let's talk, please. You understand nothing. Give me a chance to explain something. Not now. The kid will hear us. Then how about we meet at the hotel bar tonight at 10? All right. Curiosity finally took over Laura. Please go. Laura closed the door. Now she had to prepare psychologically to talk to her ex-husband, but she didn't know how. Throughout the remaining time until the conversation, she couldn't stay still. What would Frank tell her? What story would he invent? Would she have to believe any of his words? Laura had no answers to these questions. The only thing she resolved was to be tough, not sentimental, and have a critical attitude towards everything she heard. With these thoughts, and after putting Daniel to bed, she headed to the bar. She chose a free table at the back of the bar, where it was harder to hear the music, and sat down to wait. 10 minutes later, Frank appeared at the entrance. Laura made no gestures to help him find her faster. The man carefully scanned the bar and reached the farthest table. Well, hello, Laura, Frank said with a guilty voice. We've already met, Laura cut him off. Have you ordered anything yet? No. And have you come here to drink? Will it be easier to talk this way? Right now. Hold on. Frank went to the bar, ordered 2 cocktails and brought them to the table. Have the doctors already allowed you to drink? I think, after fainting, it's better to wait. I ordered one without alcohol. By the way, thank you for helping me today on the beach. If you hadn't been there, I don't know if she would have called the doctor. No problem. Why don't you take care of your health? Having a hangover in the heat. You know? Lately, I've stopped paying attention to my well-being. I guess I should be more careful. After all, I'm not 18 anymore. No. Why would you? You're already dead, and health doesn't matter to a dead man. Martha. Frank sighed heavily. I'll start talking now, please. Don't interrupt me. Listen, I beg you. I'll try. In short, 3 years ago, I started receiving threats. Our company faced a very serious organization. It all started when I took a loan for our new project. It wasn't from a bank, of course. A bank would never have accepted those terms. So I approached this dubious organization. We signed a contract. They transferred a large amount of money to us, but the contractor we chose didn't fulfill their obligations and disappeared. Later, it was said their representatives were seen in Cyprus, but it doesn't matter. I approached the credit entity, explained the situation, but of course, no one listened to me. They gave me a month to repay the debt. We went to the police, but they said they couldn't help because neither this organization nor the contractor worked officially. Since then, they started calling me, sending me emails. I was afraid they would start coming to our house, demanding the money back. How was I supposed to find that amount in a month? With each passing day, the threats became more frequent, and I decided to go away for a while. After being there for a couple of weeks, I was already planning to return when the resort guard informed me that a group of young athletes were interested in me. I understood they had found me. There was nowhere to run. Not at the airport, the train station, or even the resort. I was confused. It seemed like everything was over, that my life was over. I remember escaping then to some forest. Miraculously, I found a connection and called our CEO, Robert. I remember that conversation well. At first, he interrupted me and told me you had called asking where I was. I'm very sorry, but I couldn't tell you anything. In short, I told him everything. That's when we came up with a plan to fake my death. We used to ride snowmobiles in Norway, so we decided to take advantage of that. I informed the company employees who were there that I needed to report my death and somehow handle the rescuers. Robert was supposed to spread the news throughout the company. Well, and to visit you. How could you? Laura whispered. I was saving lives, not just mine. They could have pressured me through you. Frank took a sip of his cocktail and continued. Robert promised to help you. He helped. Well, at least something. At least something? Do you think some money or inheritance could alleviate my pain? I haven't lived for 3 years, you understand? This is my first vacation in all this time. I'm sorry, but I had no choice, you understand? Understand. Could you have taken us abroad and hidden us there? Why did you choose the cruelest way? Those people would have found you even abroad, and besides, I was in a situation where I didn't have time to leave. They were practically cornering me. You could have talked about your problems right away, without waiting for the critical point. I didn't want to burden you with that. We had a small child, so I didn't want to add unnecessary fear. You remembered the child. How many times have you seen him in the last year of your life? It hurts me a lot. In these 3 years, I've realized how much I miss my son. How do you manage? Laura exclaimed. Get away with everything. Hurt? Weak? I understand you wanted to be the best. You didn't want to burden us. But if you missed your son so much, why didn't you say you were alive? I couldn't. The danger still existed. I couldn't show up in the city at all, and phone calls could be monitored. Also, I couldn't imagine how you would react to a call from beyond. It's very noble to leave your wife mourning for 3 years with a small child. I hoped you would forget me quickly. Our relationship wasn't ideal at that time. Interesting whose fault that was. I admit I was to blame too for what happened to our relationship. And what am I supposed to do with that? Jump into your arms with joy? No need to be ironic. I really feel awful. Fine. What else happened in your life after all this? Then came 2 years of endless wandering. I changed my last name, lived in different cities, but never found a place for myself. With great relief, I received the news that the same financial organization I owed money to had been liquidated, and their leadership, employees, and thugs had been arrested. I immediately returned to our city and, with the help of old connections, started a new business. The profits were small, but I could live. Did you ever think about us, about Daniel, after you came back? Yes, I thought about it more than once, but to be honest, I was completely sure that you had already forgotten about me by then, so I didn't say anything about myself. I decided that Frank Alvarez no longer existed. Now, there's a new Frank Santos, with a new business and a new personal life. You changed your last name from Alvarez to Santos? Yes, I thought it was a great idea. Original, Laura laughed. Sometimes I remembered your laugh. Stop it. I can't listen to this. You don't need to act like a suffering husband and father, she recalled. And when you started going on your endless vacations and leaving me alone, did you also remember my laugh? I already said I'm sorry. I was a complete idiot. It's good you admit it, but your remorse doesn't erase years of pain and suffering I went through. I don't know what purpose you had for talking to me. First of all, I just wanted to explain myself, and secondly, to hear your forgiveness. So you thought that by telling your difficult story about how you were threatened and had no choice, I would be moved and forgive your deceptions and betrayals. Frank didn't know what to say. He looked at his empty glass and prepared to get another. Frank stood up and then immediately sat back down. What's wrong? Laura thought. Why does Frank feel bad again? It's going to get loud in a moment. Please don't pay attention to anything and don't listen to anything. At first, Laura didn't understand the words her ex-husband said, but soon Frank's current girlfriend, Sarah, approached the table. Ah, here you are, you bastard. I knew you'd run to women for help, she said loudly, slapping Frank. Sarah, you're misunderstanding everything. I understood you a long time ago. You're not a real man. You can't support me, and you're running around with other women. Sarah looked at Laura. Do you know she's using you? I saw her with her kid. She wants to use you, you idiot. Sarah, stop immediately. No, let her continue. Laura intervened. You're trash, and you still dare to challenge me. Sarah turned to Laura and tried to grab her hair, but Frank noticed in time, pulling Sarah back and sitting her down next to him. Let go! Let go of me right now! Calm down, Frank said loudly. She's not to blame for anything. She's guilty of stealing other people's men. Sarah had no intention of calming down. You're absolutely right, Laura continued, provoking the girl. I came to this bar specifically to take your man. There's no one as loyal, faithful, and honest as him anymore. So you lost your chance in an unequal fight with me. Laura, what are you doing? Frank tried to calm his ex-wife. Let go. I'm going to pull out all her curls, Sarah shouted. Enough, Sarah. She's my ex-wife. The girl instantly calmed down. Your ex-wife? The same one you left many years ago? Yes, her, Frank replied, slightly embarrassed, trying to avoid eye contact. You left many years ago, Laura interjected. I'd even say you failed. No, even better, you drowned. Frank didn't react to that. Of course, he hadn't told his new girlfriend all his adventures. Wait! Sarah was surprised. Is that kid I saw with her yours? Yes, he's mine. You said you didn't have kids. I lied. Sarah stayed silent for a moment, trying to process what she'd heard. Don't worry, Laura said calmly. He has very little to do with this child. Biologically only, the child has almost forgotten his father, so you can consider that he didn't lie. Laura tried to justify herself to Frank. How didn't I realize earlier how stupid you are? Sarah interrupted Frank. You left your wife, your child, and you'll leave me the same way. I can't see you anymore. Goodbye. Sarah stood up and ran out of the bar. Frank followed her. Laura was left alone with her half-drunk cocktail. She could not have imagined a week ago how her first vacation in many years would end. After such a break, as they say, she would need another one. She would have to reflect on so many events for a long time, but internally she was content. Firstly, because Frank was alive. Yes, he was despicable, a liar and a traitor. But he was alive. Secondly, Laura realized that the mourning period in her life was over. New difficulties would arise, telling Daniel about his father, but these were simply everyday problems, not tragedies. At least Laura's life would become much more interesting than before. Therefore, she didn't even pay attention to the shouts, insults, and attempts to pull her hair by the emotional girl, because she understood that a new stage in her life had begun, and the previous one would not return, not even in her memories. Laura got up and slowly left the bar. She wanted to take a walk outside. There was no one left in the hotel yard. Everyone was in their rooms or bars and restaurants. Inhaling the warm air, Laura felt she had been freed. The chains of pain had been broken. She walked away to a small park and saw Frank sitting on a bench. From your expression, I see you didn't catch her, Laura said, sitting down next to her ex-husband. I caught her, but it seems she left me for good this time. Now she's packing her things in the room. Why did you need that daycare in the first place? They didn't have a single minute without arguing. Every night I heard details of their relationships. I don't know, something kept me there. She's young and I'm not so young anymore. I wanted young energy, fun. Did you have fun? Don't mention it, Frank said, waving his hand. Listen, I don't want to scold you anymore, especially since you know everything about yourself. But tell me, don't you feel sorry for yourself? What do you mean? Look, you've been running your whole life, trying to chase money. You received death threats that forced you to fake your own death. You tried to chase happiness in your personal life and ended up with that young, noisy girl. You're not that old, and you're already fainting from hangovers. Why did you need all this? Where have you gotten? You know, in recent years I've been close to asking myself that same question, but I always escaped with trivial excuses. Money, well, of course it's never enough. It gives you freedom and security. The truth is, for me, everything turned out the opposite. Relationships, it's new energy, young blood, more vitality, joy, and here I also failed. I don't know, I'm completely lost. But you put yourself in this state. You lost yourself. But now you're feeling sorry for yourself the wrong way. But can you lament yourself differently? Of course, you have a destructive self-pity. It doesn't help at all. Quite the opposite. It will bury you even deeper. Don't pity yourself. You're beating yourself up. Productive lamentation should sound like this. Yes, my mistakes led me to a difficult situation, but I am strong enough to review my principles and try to rebuild everything. Something like that. Laura didn't even realize how her anger towards Frank disappeared. She saw a weak and insecure man, completely harmless. She even wanted to help him in some way. Laura was even scared for a second that the newly awakened feelings would manifest in such a way. After all, this was what she feared when she saw her ex-husband for the first time. But no, compassion and love are absolutely different things, although sometimes it's hard to distinguish them. And Laura felt compassion. Thank you, Laura. For what? At one point during our conversation in the bar, I thought you'd just slap me, turn around and run off. Thank you for not doing that. I really had that idea, Laura laughed. But curiosity got the better of me. Hey, how did you not get scared when you returned to the city? You had so many acquaintances, friends. Daniel and I could have recognized you. I lived not in the city itself, but nearby, in a housing community. I didn't usually appear in the center, worked mainly from home, and only went to the city by car. Then I radically changed my appearance and my last name. It seemed that was enough, and indeed the conspiracy went well until I met you. And the first time I met you also went well. Laura recalled how she saw Frank for the first time at the airport, but the wide hat didn't allow her to recognize her ex-husband. If it weren't for Daniel, maybe we wouldn't be sitting here together. Did he recognize me? Yes, I didn't expect it myself. I hoped he had already forgotten. Frank sighed deeply. I want to meet him. What for? You know you'll never be a full father to him again, but I really want to see him. You said yourself I could rebuild everything. Give me that chance, please. Laura didn't know what to say to Frank. Maybe right now, when Daniel was still young and hadn't entered adolescence, it was the right time to bring back the presence of a father in the family. But Laura was afraid to take such a decisive step. She had gotten used to raising Daniel alone. I don't know. This meeting could be very difficult for him. I understand everything. I'll try to be as correct as possible. Well, let's do this. Tomorrow morning I'll prepare him, warn him about you, then we'll meet, talk a bit. After the meeting, I'll talk to him alone. And only if he wants to see you again, we'll see what to do next. Of course then, in the hotel cafe tomorrow at 11. Yes, just remember, for Daniel, you're a traveler who explored new lands. Interesting that you thought of that, okay? I understand. Laura said goodbye and went to her room. She tossed and turned in bed and couldn't sleep until morning. It was hard for her to imagine how tomorrow's meeting would go, how Daniel would react, how Frank would behave. There were too many unpredictable factors. What if her son simply didn't want to see his father again? In these reflections, Laura remained until the alarm clock rang. She had set it for 10 a.m. to have time to prepare and explain everything to Daniel. "Mum, where are we going today?" her son asked, seeing his mother put on makeup. "Well," Laura turned to Daniel, "do you remember the passenger on the plane you called Dad?" "Well, you were right. It turned out to be your dad. Can you believe it? He came back from his trip." I told you, the boy shouted. "Are we going to see him today?" "Yes, he will be very happy to see you." "And I him." Laura was glad about her son's reaction. He was interested in his father, so psychologically this meeting should have been less difficult for Daniel than it could have been. "Where has he been all this time?" the boy asked. "He'll tell you himself." When the anticipated moment of 11 o'clock came, Laura left the room with her son. She was getting more and more nervous. Should she cancel the meeting before it was too late? Let everything stay as it was? No, there was no turning back. Laura had already told Daniel everything, and the sudden cancellation of the meeting would cause exactly the same psychological trauma that his mother feared so much. Laura and her son arrived at the cafe located on the ground floor of the hotel. Frank was already sitting inside. Seeing his ex-wife and son, he stood up and walked towards them. "Dad!" Daniel said loudly, and also approached Frank. "Hello, hello, my boy," Frank said, hugging his son. Laura greeted her ex-husband and they sat together at the table. "Well, how have you been living?" Frank asked his son. "We're living well. Here is so cool. It's our first great trip with Mum." "You're a good boy. And I always remembered you." The boy continued to share his impressions. Laura looked at him surprised. "Really? I always remembered you too." Really? I just saw that Mom wasn't very happy when I started asking about you. I think it's because she was very worried about you, so I tried not to talk about you too much when she was around. I just thought about it. "And you? Where have you been all this time?" "Me? Well, Mom, maybe she told you something." Frank held back tears with all his strength. "I was far away and couldn't come to see you. This is my job, you understand? I travel to different cities, towns, forests, lakes, and explore dangerous territories. This job requires constant presence, and we travelers rarely see our families. So, why don't you quit that job so Mom and I can see you more often?" "But someone has to do it. Let those who have no one waiting for them do it." Frank realized he could no longer hold back his emotions. He pretended to receive an urgent call and ran to the bathroom. Yes, sometimes men also need to cry in such situations. "See, Daniel, what a stressful job your dad has," Laura said, staying alone with her son. "Even on vacation, they keep calling and distracting him." "And why does he have to have that job?" protested the boy. "Everyone has their vocation," she responded. A couple of minutes later, Frank returned. "Forgive me, please. I had to interrupt," he said. "We were talking about your stressful and long-lasting job that doesn't allow you to be with your son," Laura said, bringing the conversation to the main topic, Frank's future involvement in Daniel's upbringing. "Yes, about the job," Frank said a bit hesitantly. You know, Daniel, I just quit that job right now on the phone. Really? Hooray! So, now we'll see each other more often? The boy asked joyfully. Yes, we'll definitely see each other more often, Frank said, looking at Laura. Well, if Mum doesn't object, of course. Mum, do you object? No, but how often you see each other will depend largely on Dad, Laura said. I promise we'll see each other as often as possible, Frank said firmly to his son. And why can't you just come back to live with us like before? Daniel asked. Frank didn't know how to respond to Daniel. He looked confused at his ex-wife. Laura tried to find a way out of the situation. Because Dad will have to gradually start a new life, find a new job, and won't have time to be with us all the time. But then, when he finds one, will he be able to do it? Daniel asked, putting Laura and Frank in an even more uncomfortable situation. We don't know what will happen then, we'll see. Laura dodged the question. Frank, Laura, and Daniel sat at the table and talked for a long time. They discussed vacations, the sea, and travel, talked about their lives, and planned for the future. At breakfast, in the cafe, the day didn't end. Everyone went to the beach together. Frank even started teaching his son to swim. It seemed that they understood each other immediately. Even Danielle's mother hadn't been as interested in the teaching process as Frank. Laura watched all this and remembered the times when her relationship with Frank was just beginning and when Danielle was just born. It was a pleasant nostalgia, but Laura quickly pulled herself together. She couldn't simply forget Frank's actions, his betrayals, and infidelities. Even though Frank had changed a lot over time and things seemed to be going well with his son, it was necessary to keep a distance to avoid stepping on the same slippery grounds. In the afternoon, the three went out for a walk around the city. From Laura's point of view, Frank and Daniel seemed like a truly happy family. When it got dark, they returned to the hotel. Saying goodbye in the elevator, Laura and Daniel went into their room. Did you enjoy being with Dad? Laura asked. Yes, a lot. I want us to spend every day together like this. That's not possible every day. We fly back tomorrow. What? Tomorrow? Yes. Laura seemed to have forgotten all about their adventures during the vacation. What a shame. Are we flying back with Dad? No, he will fly later. Next time we'll meet him in our city. Do I have to wait again? Don't worry. This time you'll have to wait much less, Laura replied hopefully. Mum, why can't you and Dad live together like before? I've explained it to you. That's how life is. Sometimes you have to choose what you don't like much. Dad had to take this path. But everything will change. We'll go on these trips more often. We'll see Dad more. Will you like that? Okay, said the boy, yawning, and he went to his bed. Laura also lay down soon, but a few minutes later the phone rang. Laura quietly went out to the balcony and closed the door tightly not to wake her son. Hello, Laura. Is that you? Said Frank on the phone. Yes, you have my number? See? Well, how is Daniel? Did you talk to him? Yes, he's happy. That's great. How about we repeat the walk tomorrow? No, we leave tomorrow. I almost forgot that. Luckily, my phone reminder worked. Ah, so soon. I'm staying for another 3 days. And tomorrow there's no chance to meet? In the morning, just for a short time, just the two of us. I told Daniel that next time you'll meet after our flight. Why did you rush it? He already has too many impressions from today. I think it's better to establish contact gradually. You're probably right. Where will we meet? Let's go to the park in the hotel courtyard. All right. Good night, and see you tomorrow. This time, Laura fell asleep quickly, despite the upcoming conversation with her ex-husband. The sleepless night before and the eventful day had taken their toll. Where are you going, Mom? asked Daniel sleepily, seeing his mother leaving again. Quick business? Sleep? Sleep? Laura replied. She quickly left the room, took the elevator down to the first floor, and went out to the hotel courtyard. Frank had not arrived yet. Why did I come out so early? Thought Laura. I should have come later. I've given myself a few more tense minutes. But she didn't have to wait long. Frank entered the park shortly, wearing a light suit and his wide hat. Hi, have you been waiting long? Frank asked. No, just a couple of minutes, Laura replied calmly. Hey, since we have another short pause, just a couple of days, but a pause nonetheless, I'd like to ask you something. Have you really forgiven me? Yes, I have, Laura responded calmly. I rarely hold grudges. You're a very wise woman. I couldn't sleep for a long time thinking about Daniel and you. Do you remember he asked me why we can't live together again? Yes, I remember. He asked me that question again last night. Then, maybe you're right after all. If you've forgiven me, if we can get along with Daniel, why don't we start over? What do you think of that idea? Do you agree? No, Laura replied after a brief silence. Getting those words out was a struggle. Laura recalled the warnings she gave herself on the beach not to repeat past mistakes. Saying yes hastily could be precisely that mistake. Everything had happened too quickly and unexpectedly. In reality, she had only known the new Frank for a few days. That was not enough to start a serious relationship and a life together, and the forgiveness she gave Frank did not mean they could start a new relationship. Forgiving is one thing, but not allowing a new offense is another. Frank did not argue with Laura's refusal. He nodded and said, I understand your answer. If I were in your place, I wouldn't forgive myself, but thank you for that. The important thing is that my refusal does not affect in any way so that the child has a father again. Don't worry about that. As soon as I arrive, I'll come straight to you. Please let me know when you arrive and then stay in touch. All right. Don't disappear either. This time I won't disappear. Laura needed to go back to her room and get ready to go to the airport. Both she and Frank clearly wanted to hug each other to say goodbye, but they didn't. Maybe by saying no, Laura had made the hardest decision of her life. She had always been a steadfast person since her childhood, but by overcoming all her feelings, Laura proved to herself that she was strong and independent of feelings. Already turning around, she heard Frank calling her. Wait, is there anything else? Yes, tell me, please. Is your refusal forever, or do I still have a chance? Let's live and see, Laura replied, and quickly walked back to the hotel. In the elevator, her eyes filled with tears. No, they were not tears of sadness for saying goodbye to Frank, as they would see each other again in a few days. They were tears of joy. Joy for new experiences, new pages of life. In these vacation days, Laura learned to face life in a different way, to control her emotions and feelings, to find the father of her son, but at the same time not to fall into a meaningless and naive relationship with Frank. Only a wise woman can maintain that balance, and that is what Laura became during these warm summer days.